EA has a pretty bad rep to say the least. They're very well known for treating their employees like crap, buying out developers just to let them die shortly after, and cramming their games with microtransactions and loot boxes. Oh, I'm sorry, surprise mechanics. They were voted worst company in America, like what, 3 years in a row? They've done a few things to try to combat this view of them, but people can typically see what they're doing. But this still undeniably resulted in some pretty great things. One of the things they've been doing to make the public perception of them a bit better is to fund indie games under the label EA Originals. Games like Unravel and A Way Out exist because of this, but today I'm going to be covering the game Fe. I don't actually know how it's pronounced, I've been calling it Fe, so that's what I'm going to call it. I first saw the game Fe a few years ago at E3, and I was immediately interested because it kind of reminded me of Spyro, because of course it did. You play as a quadruped who can glide, and yes, it's a very loose connection, but at this point in time, I was so desperate for more Spyro content, I got the Japanese version of Spyro 1, just because it happens to have one more collectible, if you happen to have one of these things. Ignoring the fact it controls and plays worse, far worse than the American Intel versions, but whatever. Anyway, thanks to this very, very vague Spyro connection, I was immediately interested and wanted the game, and I got it shortly after it came out on the Switch. Unlike a lot of 3D platformers, Fe actually has a decent focus in the story. It's not anything too complicated, but the developers definitely had a story they wanted to tell. It's one of those games where the story isn't straight up said, and instead you have to piece it together yourself. The game tells a story through events taking place in front of you, markings on rocks, and these flashback sequences. I honestly didn't piece too much together, and I'm not sure if it's because I'm a stupid dum-dum, or if the game just wasn't clear enough. But from what little I did piece together, the story goes like this. A forest is invaded by what I'd assume to be aliens, and Fe, a fox, bird-like creature, has to stop them by working with other animals. There's definitely a lot more to this story, like I'm pretty sure these alien guys are supposed to be corrupted, because you see what I believe is supposed to be a transformation sequence. I think anyway. From what little I did get out of this, I did find it interesting enough, though I do feel like these flashback sequences are a bit too common, and I don't think every one of them is all that unique. Seriously, I think like half of them involve this giant deer being chained down. Thankfully, you can just not play these parts by ignoring the rocks that give Fe these visions, so I guess it's not a big deal, but they definitely should have had a bit more variety in what happens in these either way. I think the story is interesting, but it's not the clearest thing in the world, at least not to me, but then again, some people do love stuff like this. That's a huge reason why Journey blew up, and I had literally no idea what was happening in that game despite playing through it twice. If you're one of those people, then there actually might be something here for you. If not, well, that's fine, the story isn't why I like this game. This game is mainly a 3D platformer with some stealth and light puzzle solving. You play as Fe, that fox bird creature I mentioned earlier, and your goal is to simply get to the end of each area while avoiding the aliens. You do this largely by helping out nearby animals so they can later help you. In this game you can howl, or sing as this game calls it, to talk to animals. The thing is, only young animals can understand you by default and the adults can't. So the game will have you do things like bring back all of the parents' eggs or get their kids back home, and they'll teach you their language as a thank you. The reason why you want to know their language is because you need their voice to do certain things. Like, yes, the small animals can do some of this stuff for you, but they can only do so much and they're not always going to be there. So in other words, the small animals basically act as a tutorial to give you a taste of any upcoming abilities, while severely limiting what you can and can't do with it. I guess it's comparable to the first 10 minutes of Portal, how everything is very automatic very early on, but it's done to get you familiar with the main mechanic of that game. The abilities you require from other animal voices are typically just to open up paths, like Ferris can open up these buds and act as springs to launch you forward. These cave creatures can glow up mushrooms to light up the caves, or retract the same mushrooms to clear a path. Probably the most fun of these would be these wind flower things. They allow you to gain a bunch of height while gliding, and they're just a lot of fun to use. They're kind of like a more free whirlwind from Spyro, I guess. You get this ability from the moose howl, because that's what moose are known for. Flying. I guess my one complaint is I wish having the proper voice meant that specific animals would help you out more rather than just unlock what are basically new paths. Okay, they do this, like you can ride large birds or that cave creature for a traversal, but I feel like there's more you can do with this than just that. I just feel like there's a lot of untapped potential here. Like, I don't think there's any puzzles in this game that require another animal. I mean, aside from dragging this poor creature around just to open up some buds. Freaking Spyro 3 had a puzzle based around relying on another animal's assistance. I'm not exactly saying copy that puzzle, especially considering I don't know how well that fit this game, but what I am saying is I may not be creative enough to give out any ideas, but a similar thing can be done and has been done, and I'm sure there was something they could have thought of. I also love the idea of a larger animal protecting you, but I think that's done a grand total of 1 time and the moose only attacks like 3 aliens. Considering you have absolutely no way of defending yourself and there's a lot of larger animals in this game, I feel like it's such an obvious thing that they just didn't do enough. Instead of relying on other animals to be your bodyguard, you're going to have to be very stealthy. I do love the stealth in this game. It can be really exhilarating to just barely get back into a bush immediately after losing an alien, or to run away from a giant creature. Or how about those parts where you have to unbrainwash the cave creatures by pulling this ball off their tail? As much as I love the stealth, to go back to the bodyguard thing, can you imagine if those cave creatures started to fight back immediately after regaining control? Instead they just kind of wander around until they inevitably get brainwashed again. I really do love the stealth in this game, but I think more moments like this would have been great and added a lot of variety. The way this game is structured is you find this area with this giant tree pretty early on. This is basically the hub world of the game, as it has several paths that branch out to the rest of the game. And you always find yourself back in the hub whenever you complete an area. They block off paths leading to future areas by having something in the way that requires the previous area's animal howl. I think this is a fine way to structure the game. It's simple, and this also means this is one of those games where there aren't any visible loading screens, which is pretty neat and helps with the immersion. Though I will say that Central Hub is kind of annoying to navigate since it's a wide open forest area without too many landmarks, and unfortunately, this problem extends to the main levels too. This game is mostly linear, and I only find this to be an issue in the more open-ended areas, so it's not too big of a deal, especially considering they give you a map that typically tells you where to go, and you can even call this small bird at any point that acts as your guide and flies to where you need to go. So this is mostly only an issue if you decide to explore and try to find secrets. The reason you want to look for secrets is because there's hidden crystals everywhere. Sometimes you'll have to solve a puzzle, do a platforming challenge, or even go to a previous area with abilities you didn't have before. Finding them can be a lot of fun, but this game doesn't have a warp system, so I'd imagine going for all of them would be really tedious, but I didn't do that, so whatever. The interesting thing about these unlockable abilities are only the first 2 are required, which would be tree climbing and gliding. The last 4 are only there if you happen to gather enough of the crystals. Of course. Heck, I didn't even unlock the last 2, so I genuinely have no idea what they are. I can at least explain the first 2, the first one. The first unlockable ability just makes you run faster. Faye gets on all 4s and charges forward. As for the second one, I don't know. Okay, so this game did a pretty bad job explaining what this ability is, and from my angle it kinda just looked like I died faster and I fail to see how that's useful. Okay, after looking back at the footage, I apparently am a stupid dum-dum. I am very clearly gliding faster there, not diving. No idea why I remembered it that way. The actually required abilities are unsurprisingly the best. The first one you get is climbing trees. This one's a lot of fun and is a route for some of the best platforming in this game. It makes you feel a lot like a squirrel, and it's just a lot of fun to zip up a tree to follow that up with a big jump to another tree. Then there's the glide, which is the thing that drew me to the game to begin with because it reminded me of Spyro. Just like Spyro, this adds a lot to the platforming, and they like to do things like combine the glide with the windflowers and trees, making for some of the best platforming in the game. The platforming in this game never gets all that hard, but thanks to all the previously mentioned abilities, I still think it's a lot of fun. Though I will say this one part where you climb up the giant deer was pretty irritating. You have to climb up the legs while it's walking, and that just isn't a good time. The steps it takes are so much larger than you'd think, but once you do get up those legs, it becomes one of the coolest moments in the game. This is what I'm saying when I say gliding and climbing allow for some really great platforming. Not only is this segment a lot of fun to do, at least once you get up those legs, but my god, the atmosphere is incredible. Climbing up a giant creature is just a cool idea I want to see more in platformers. And the music is really well done here. This game uses a lot of violins to set a certain mood, and this is a shining example of that. I normally don't care for when platformers go for atmospheric music over traditional music. Heck, that was one of my only real complaints with Spyro 2's soundtrack. I personally wasn't a fan of the way they handled the hub music in that game, but this is obviously a very different kind of platformer, and I don't really think catchy, upbeat music would work well for a game like this. This game also goes for a very different art style. I'm sure you've noticed by now, but everything looks like it's made out of crystal with one main color being used at a time, and I kinda love it. You might think this would make the game look very samey after a while, and I'm sure it does to some people, but personally I didn't think that. You're exploring more than just a forest in this game. You're exploring a swamp, a mountain, a cave, and a winter tundra. All of these areas look pretty distinct to me, so I never got bored of the aesthetic, and it definitely helps this game is only about 4 hours long. Though you do spend more time in the forest compared to other areas, so your opinion may be different than mine. One thing this game does to help differentiate each area from each other is change the main color being used, and I really love how the color changes to more harsh colors like orange when there's aliens everywhere, or how they use calmer colors like blue when you're safe. The only major criticism I have for the graphics would be the performance. I am playing the Nintendo Switch version, and obviously the Switch is by far the weakest current gen console, so I'd imagine it runs fine on other platforms, and from what I've seen, it does. But man, the Switch version does not run fine. Okay, maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit because it is playable, but it's definitely really distracting. Nothing about this game seems like something the Switch can't handle, and I know this is an indie game, but it is funded by EA and I'm sure they have the money to make it a much better port. I'm not saying the Switch port is straight up bad. It really only got to this level a handful of times, but I'm sure it could have been done much better. I mean, if you really like portability or the Switch is your only console, then go for it. The frame rate is definitely distracting, but it's by no means unplayable. Faye is definitely an interesting game. I don't really see 3D platformers take on a tone like this. They're typically much more bright and colorful, and obviously there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, how many times have I mentioned Spyro in this video? It's just that it's nice to see a 3D platformer do something different. I had a good time with this game despite the occasional time I felt there was a missed opportunity or a frame rate stutter. This game goes for $20 and I feel like that might be a bit much for a game that's only about 4 hours long and has some mixed reviews. Yeah, I didn't talk about this, but this game has a good amount of people thinking this game is just okay. I try to understand why, but I just don't agree with most of the criticism. So I'd say it's best to keep in mind there's a decent chance you won't agree with me on this game. Though I would still say it's worth a go. It's an interesting platformer, and there's not many games like it. But again, I would say it's best to wait on a sale. I personally got it for $10 a while ago, and I don't regret paying that much, but $20, I don't know, that's a bit much. It's available on PS4, Xbox One, Nintendo Switch, and PC. But like I said, the Switch version suffers from some performance issues, and the PC version isn't available on Steam. Instead, you have to get it through Origin, so keep that in mind. I normally talk about the final boss in these videos, but I didn't do that for this game because, one, there is no final boss, and two, the final section of the game is just more solid platforming with some story stuff attached to it. And as I've made clear in this video, I didn't really understand the story, so I just decided to not talk about it. Anyway, that was Faye. I had a good time covering this one. A very interesting game, and not many people talk about it. But for my next video, I kind of want to go back to something else that's a lot more mainstream. I started this channel off by reviewing the Spyro the Dragon series. You know, a series I mentioned like 20 times in this video. And well, I decided, you know what, I think it's time to finally review what I believe to be the Nintendo 64 equivalent, Banjo-Kazooie. See you then.